Welcome to the Marketecture podcast. This is episode 4, which I believe Eric told me last week was impossible. 90% of podcasts don't hit episode 4, so we've made a huge amount of progress. Is that right, Eric?
We made it. 90% of podcasts don't make it past the 3rd episode, and then of those 90% don't make it past episode 20.
Okay, now we have stretch goals. We're trying to get to episode 21. All right, so the Marketecture podcast is a new thing we're doing, which is a weekly discussion of topics in ad tech and martech. I'm here with Eric Franchi, as well as our guest Mike O'Sullivan, the CEO of Sincera.io. Welcome, guys.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Quick disclosure, I'm an investor in Sincera. So if I'm nice to Mike, that would be why. So Mike, tell us what Sincera is.
Yeah, certainly. So what Sincera is essentially a modern verification service. And what we mean by that is that there's just a series of questions that folks have about digital advertising that for so long have gone unanswered. You only have to look back at a bunch of press where there would be speculation in trades. It's like, hey, this is changing because 3 people told us they think it is. And there was nothing really quantified about it. And a lot of the verification providers, they do a great job at, viewability and contextual detection, but no one was really tackling all of these new questions around consent, around identity, which we'll be talking about today, and other areas that directly impact, a digital advertising business. So that's what we're focusing on is working with customers and providing answers at scale for some of these questions.
Yeah, so to kind of give a little more color on that, it's sort of like a census of out there, what technologies are being used, what the interactions of those technologies. Is that a good way to think about it?
I think you could think about it that way if the census was programmatically collected and, deterministic. So yeah, I think that's fair. And then if you think about, how complex a modern publisher's environment can be at some point, you can see that there's a lot of information that can be collected. So yeah, I think you can think about it as, at least on the first way that a lot of people connect with the company, it's a digital census.
Got it. All right. Well, one of the reasons I wanted to have Mike on is that he tweeted this really fun chart at his, you should follow him on Twitter, at Mike O'Sullivan, that was the top identifiers. So I think we all know that third-party cookies are going away, and there's this somewhat of a Game of Thrones going on where a bunch of companies are trying to have their identifiers adopted as kind of the next identifier. And we could talk about whether it's there will only be one kind of situation, a Highlander, I'm mixing sci-fi now, a Highlander situation, or whether there'll be multiple, but that's not kind of the important point. The interesting part was that Sincera, through its data, has a ranking of which identifiers it sees the most. So before we go into that, Mike, what does it mean for a identifier to be ranked in this way? What is this, the amount of websites or something else?
Yeah. So there's sort of 2 ways that we measure the identifier popularity, let's call it. So the first is, let's call it deployments and configuration. The publisher has actively made the choice to enable this identifier for their buyers and others who interact with their ecosystem. This is very different than what you would see historically of a lot of identifiers in the, third-party cookie sync era, which are just firing freely on publisher sites. And that still happens, but the publisher hasn't made a choice for this to happen. So this is really about which identifiers are publishers choosing to deploy. They make an active choice to enable this technology.
And presumably they're choosing that because it makes them money downstream, or they think it will in the future.
I think they're fishing in some cases. The average publisher has about 5.4 identifiers deployed, and that doesn't count duplicates. So they're basically seeing which is going to win the horse race, and we want to have benefit whichever one does.
And how many total identifiers do you think there are out there right now?
Well, if you count the legacy third-party cookie IDs, I would say well north of 200.
Wow. Okay.
300. Yeah, well, probably closer to 300, I would say. And then what's funny is there's tons of zombie identifiers out there too. That would be another interesting topic. It's let's go find companies that no longer exist, but there's still, pixels firing for those IDs getting dropped all over the place.
Yeah.
And then of the ones that really matter, it's a much smaller list for ones that are configured for post cookie. I would say there's probably under 20 that could conceivably matter.
Right. It's a post-cookie. These are going to be a mixture of probabilistic or deterministic hashed emails, things like that. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think, for most folks who don't sort of live and breathe this horse race, I think that's probably the most useful question to ask if you're ever talking about an identifier. Like, is this deterministic? And by deterministic, we mean 100% exclusively deterministic, or is this probabilistic? That's probably the one most useful question you can ask. And folks that are probabilistic often have a mix. They're like, we do both. And that's great, but it's not 100% deterministic. Like, that's the real sort of demarcation point, I would say, for these post-cookie IDs.
All right, so let's get down to it. What we're going to do is a David Letterman style top 10 countdown of the top 10 IDs. For those of you who are younger than old people like me and Eric, David Letterman used to be a comedian on television, and he did a countdown of top 10 things. So let's just go through the top 10 and say who they are, what we know about them, any other color commentary. Feel free to make fun of them if you'd like. So
Okay.
The 10th most common ID would be Mercury, if I'm reading this chart correctly.
Yeah. So that's from M1, and that's inside an agency, which is unique to the list. It started off very deterministic, and now it's a mix of probabilistic and deterministic IDs. It was once they started only for audience-based matching, meaning they never exposed the ID for the broader ecosystem. But now they're doing a lot more identifier-specific disclosure and sharing. They're very selective about the publishers who use it. I would think that's probably the most unique element of Mercury.
And Mercury spelled with a K because it was spun out of Merkel, I believe. So
That's
Mercury.
Right. It's the old M1 ID.
Right. So this is benefiting mostly those customers.
Is this the only identifier that's connected to an agency, or is it certainly the only scaled one?
Yeah, I would say it is the only scaled and owned by an agency, which I think is pretty cool too.
Yeah, well, I wonder why there's not more of that, or maybe it's to come.
I think it's a huge technology investment to do it, and I think the fact that they acquired Merkle made it gave them a head start, but it's a huge investment.
Yeah, and it does put an extra burden on them operationally because they would need all of their partners on the buy side to sync or adopt. All right, next, number 9, AMX RTB ID. I have no idea what that is.
This one is a little bit of an out there one too. This one is probabilistic and IP based. So I don't know a ton of folks that use it. It's not as popular, and it's not as popular in terms of SSP bidders picking it up. But it is.
Who owns it? Who operates it? What does AMX stand for?
It might be Admixer.
Yeah, AMX RTB ID. We'll do a real-time David follow.
Eric, remind me who Admixer is. I'm sorry if Admixer's listening. I just don't remember.
Yeah, not familiar either.
Okay, great. Good ad for Admixer. Admixer, you got to come on to Marketecture.
Yeah, they're a full stack solution. They have I believe they have an SSP in pre-bid. They have a DSP. It's one of those ones where if you don't really work with them, it's tough to know because they have kind of a full stack. I don't think they're necessarily like a cafe media, but they're kind of a full stop shop.
Okay. Number 8, Quantcast. I think we all know Quantcast.
Yeah. So Quantcast is a little bit more well known in terms of what these guys are doing. This is actually a pretty straightforward first party cookie ID. So there are a few of the IDs in here that are essentially what third party cookies are today, but only for the first party space. So a publisher can use this for frequency capping and session capping on their own inventory, but not on others.
Right. So Quantcast has had this tag on their pages, on many publisher pages for years. So now they're enabling the publishers to access the data in a first party context.
The publishers can control the deployment now.
Got it. Number 7, it's a little hard to read on your chart. It's unified something. There's 2 unifieds.
Good product feedback, Ari. Thank you. We'll clarify that. That's Unified ID 2.0 from Trade Desk.
A little surprising to see it down at number 7. I would think it would have been higher.
Yeah, Sam. What do you make of that, Mike?
Yeah, so what's interesting that the chart, I think, points out is that press and activity doesn't necessarily correlate to footprint. There is a lot of interest in Unified ID 2.0. In general, the deterministic IDs have a harder time, or they put much more due diligence into the publishers they work with because of the fact that they're 100% deterministically tied to like email hashes or phone numbers. So I think it's a function of there is headwinds with deterministic IDs as sort of one. And then two, there's also an element here that you'll see that, there's a huge time horizon. Publishers are super slow to update and change their configuration. So to put this in context, the majority of the publishers on this chart, although not all of them, are sourced from Prebid, as well as the Index Exchange Library, Amazon, APS. But over 50% of Prebid publishers are on a version of Prebid that is 2 major versions old. Like imagine if you were to encounter someone who had an iOS device or an iPhone that was 2 major versions behind. But that's the reality. So there is a time element here. It's very rare, although we will see it in a few of these IDs where new IDs sort of jump to the top. But because Unified ID 2.0 is 100% deterministic, it requires a relationship or some sort of conversation with trade desks to get it deployed and working properly. It's going to take a while to move up. But,
and so is your point about Prebid that if it's an old Prebid, it's hard to get a new identifier?
Right. Like the module, so if you're on an old version of Prebid, there's 2 things. One, it may not even have the Unified ID 2.0 module deployed. You haven't touched your adapters in 2 years, right? And This adapter has only been around for 22, 26 months. It's possible that the last time you updated your Prebid, Unified ID 2.0 support didn't exist. And then again, the deterministic component.
Hard to get people to give their emails.
Yeah, we should point out that, Mike, this was something that you put some context on your tweet. From Unified ID 2.0 to Quantcast, there's like a 50% drop in terms of the deployment of it. So you're starting to see a bit of a power law emerging.
Definitely, this is a top 10 list. But not all are created equal. There is definitely a breakpoint getting established here between Unified ID 2.0 and Quantcast.
All right, let's move on to number 6, Ramp ID, which I think we're all pretty familiar with from LiveRamp.
Ramp ID and Unified ID 2.0 are the only 100% deterministic identifiers. So I think that is something that's going very strongly in their direction. It does make it harder to deploy. They can't just go after a huge long tail. You can't just enable every single automatic WordPress publisher to suddenly use Ramp ID the way some of these probabilistic ID solutions can. So a very strong showing. We actually built another metric that we can talk about at the end called absorption, because one of the things that we noticed was that some of these deterministic IDs that are used very heavily by marketers were kind of in the 6-7 spot, despite their prevalence of actually being utilized in the ecosystem.
So I'm sorry, what would absorption mean?
So ID absorption, and if you check out our site, it's free for all at app.sincera.io. Absorption just says quite simply, okay, the ID is there by the publisher, but how many SSPs are picking it up? Something like Ramp ID has a much higher absorption because it's in demand.
Right. It's actually being used to transact. Some of these IDs are more, to come that we expect DSPs to adopt them and to be able to transact, whereas others are currently being used quite a bit. All right, number 5, Panorama.
Yeah, so Panorama is a mixed ID, heavily probabilistic, but taking in some deterministic elements. And it's from Lotame. And I think the thing that's super interesting about Panorama to me is just the amount of growth that they've done on this chart. And so, full disclosure, they're a customer, but 7 of the top 8 IDs are customers of Sincera. But what's really interesting about Panorama is they have been jumping up this chart really, really quickly. And that's not something you typically see in this space. Like I said, usually it's it takes a long time for publishers to sort of adopt and move up. But Panorama's growth has been really, really notable.
That's interesting. As an editorial note, I interviewed Andy Monfried for the Marketecture website and podcast just this week. So that interview will probably come out in a week or 2. So look forward to that. And he does discuss Panorama.
What's also interesting is Lotame was founded in 2006. So this is not a startup. This is a mature business that seems to be sort of in its third wave. So hats off to them.
Yeah. Also, they were firmly positioned as a DMP, which is a very unpopular sort of passé category, and they've shifted. And their new use case is really about activation. So you go from your customer management platform into Lotame for activation. That's at least how they're positioning themselves.
Yeah, spherical, I think, is their new feature set. It is, the product velocity is really quite impressive for a company of that age.
All right, enough with the Load-Me commercial. Number 4, another unified. So is this Unified ID 1?
Yeah, this is Unified ID 1.0. And this kind of also proves the point of the time horizon. Unified ID 1.0 was probably the first ID that we built. It started at Index, but then we ported the code to Prebid, those of us who worked on some of this early identifier functionality for publishers. And Unified ID 1.0 is the Trade Desk's DSP cookie-based ID. It is the one they've been using all this time. It used to be called adserver.org. And it's very interesting that it's got such a big footprint because it was the first. And so it's had the most time to just sort of like passively get picked up. And, it got a lot of interest to begin with because it was something new and unique. But I don't think this is meaningfully used by anyone other than Trade Desk.
Yeah, I think Unified ID generates immediate revenue for publishers because the Trade Desk is the largest or second largest DSP out there. But it's not really a Unified ID. It's a bit of marketing. It's no one else uses it besides Trade Desk.
Right.
All right, number 3, Criteo.
So Criteo's idea is super interesting. Externally, it mostly functions as a cookie-based ID. I don't really think it's used broadly beyond anyone other than Criteo. But what's super fascinating about Criteo is that it is tied to a really monstrous graph that they have. And I worked there many years ago, and the graph was measured in the billions, and 50% of it was deterministic. So if you think about and it makes sense, all that shopping data, all that transaction data, it's a really super powerful graph that is behind this ID. Again, much like Unified ID 1 to Trade Desk, it benefits Criteo spend, which is great. I don't know if it benefits many others, but it is, I would say, one of the biggest and most powerful graphs on this chart. And even LiveRamp is super big and 100% deterministic. LiveRamp is very focused in the US, and Criteo has a much larger international footprint.
Yeah, they're different business models here. So the Criteo, I imagine, to use your phrase, probably has very low absorption because Criteo pretty much uses its own bidder and its own tags. It doesn't need to go through the SSP to DSP channel, and no one else uses it besides Criteo. Mm-hmm. So Criteo, Unified ID, those are both basically ways that publishers can juice the revenue by having better connections with some of the largest buyers out there. Makes sense.
And they grow only at the pace that these businesses grow. So it's not like, you'd expect, and maybe I'm wrong here on this, Mike, you correct me if I am, you probably don't expect them to, at least organically, take a giant jump up the rankings unless something happens with their business and, things take off.
Yeah, I don't see them taking a jump up the rankings, but to Ari's point, if you were to sort of pivot this and say which is going to have the biggest spend impact, I think for now those two are certainly there, and then followed by Ramp ID, because you certainly see a lot of buying on particularly like Safari-based traffic, and there's a real focus of enriching that with like their ATS product. So there's a bunch of case studies out about lifts and increased bid activity on Ramp ID, but Ramp ID to me is the one who would most likely have continued to ramp in terms of ad spend on cookieless traffic.
You heard it here. Ramp is going to ramp. I think there is a world where Unified ID 2 is more broadly adopted than Unified ID 1 because if it has that deterministic ID, you can imagine other DSPs potentially playing nice with that.
Yeah, they're actively investing in it too. So there's a ton of features coming around Unified ID 2 to make it easier to deploy and stuff. So I think you're right.
All right, number 2, we're getting to the top. So this is also cut off, so I don't have the full name, but it's Prebid something.
All right. The repeated feedback doesn't get it to the top of the backlog here, Ari. But so
it's an Excel spreadsheet.
So the Prebid shared ID is number 2. And this is similar to the use case that we talked about with Quantcast, which is that it's basically a first-party cookie-based ID. So it's unique per publisher. And publishers can use it in a variety of ways, frequency cappings, some degree of session targeting. If they want to get super crazy, they could use Google's program to pass in this into DFP. But what's interesting about this one, to me, Prebid shared ID, this is kind of like the toy in the cereal box. You install Prebid and it just kind of comes with it. So I don't know, it's got a huge footprint and it's potentially a huge opportunity. I don't know how many publishers are actually using it. I don't hear a ton actually using it. And then Prebid sort of has a question, like, is it just always going to say, is there enough utility in this sort of simple first party ID for them to sort of make something more of it? Or does the functionality need to change? But it has a huge footprint. But I think it just sort of, a lot of times it just comes along for the ride with a Prebid deployment.
So, drum roll, maybe. So the number one most commonly found identifier is ID5.
Yeah.
So quick disclaimer, both Eric and I are investors in ID5, but that has nothing to do with the fact that we're covering it here. So ID5, bit of a surprise here. So why are they on top? And what are they?
Yeah. So ID5, has used this chart to sort of say, as part of their sales materials, like, we're the number one identity graph you haven't heard of. I think it's kind of tongue in cheek, but it's very telling. And I think they've done a super good job strategy wise to really focus on the sell side and sort of go to all these publishers and be really disciplined from an international perspective, not just focusing on the US or a specific market, and say, like, enable our ID. Doesn't cost you anything as a publisher. We'll eventually, we'll work towards driving additional ad spend. So in today's world that still has third-party cookies and third-party IDs on cookies, they also have an offering that does like graph matching, which does have an ad spend implication for using ID5. Not really a huge element for this, but how they did it was just really going out, talking to a ton of publishers, getting it deployed, being disciplined in driving that scale. Again, they are a customer of Sincera and they can use our data to find gaps and grow their footprint. But I thought it was super interesting to them from a strategy perspective that they really intentionally focused on the sell side first to get scale. And now they're winning some really big deals on the marketing side. They won a very big deal. And Matt told me I could mention it, but I'm still not going to name the name. I'll let him sort of say it. But they're getting some big marketers who want to use their ID, not just for targeting, but for attribution purposes. So I think it's an interesting strategy, going super hard on sell side and then sort of leveraging that on the buy side. I feel like Panorama is sort of a fast follow on this strategy.
Yeah, I think that's probably why they're top of the charts. They're European based, for those who don't know, and they went pretty hard in European publishers with a post GDPR pitch that was probabilistic, so it could cover as much as possible. And now they're top of the charts. So, I mean, we spent like 10, 15 minutes on this list, and now I have to ask the question for both Eric and Mike. Like, does it matter? Does having a bigger footprint necessarily mean you're going to generate more revenue, more reach for customers? Is this indicative of who's going to win these sort of identity wars?
So I think there's two lenses I would sort of see, like, does it matter and who's going to win? I think the ID5 example is instructive because I think what actually matters is what marketers use. Because marketers won't use 5 different IDs the way the publishers do. Like, they're integrating, as you mentioned, Ari, like tying it into CRM, pushing it in, experimenting with clean rooms, like all these things. Like, they can really only afford to have one identifier, if any, as a currency. So does the sell side footprint matter? I think it does, insofar as it gets you into the conversation with the marketer. Like, ID5 couldn't have conversations with the top 100, top 50 marketer if they didn't have this footprint. They can't just say, we've got this great tech. So it's the marketer utilization that really matters, which is why, like, I think something like Ramp ID and LiveRamp is super strong. Like, Unified ID 2.0 has a huge amount of opportunity. It's not the footprint that matters. It's convincing the marketers based on the footprint.
Yeah, I agree with Mike. I think, there's definitely a scale element to this, right? Like, you can't service a large global marketer or a large global agency without the scale, right? So I think that's number one. And then, number two, particularly from, an identity perspective, there's not going to be integrations with, a whole bunch of identifiers. It's not like, buying media. It's not, it's a completely different business. So I think scale becomes important, and then it plays into is it just one, or is it going to be, 3? Is it going to be 5? Because, as of to date, you need both deterministic and probabilistic to just grow your ability to target.
Yeah, I'm definitely a believer of it's not winner takes all, it's top 5 winners take all or something like that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah, there'll be a couple of deterministic, a couple of probabilistic in some combinations that you can use. And I would also think that like tying an identity to a particular platform is a really sort of risky strategy because effectively if someone doesn't want to use your platform for one reason or another, that identity is no longer useful to you.
I think DSPs sort of found that out. And Ari, maybe you can tell us like the hard way. A lot of people sort of crow about, oh, third-party cookies they were just a hack. We didn't mean for them to be like this. And all that is true, I guess. But the DSP function, like the core functionality of a DSP and the technical design, predicated that there is a internal ID that the DSP uses, and that is their cookie-based ID. So DSPs, like generation 1 DSPs, were all built with that expectation. And that's one of the reasons it took so long for these ID adoptions to occur, is because there had to be like a significant architecture re-architecture done on DSPs to say, hey, there's a universe of IDs and we can ingest any of them and action on them in different ways. Like to your point, like that's the way software in the ad tech space needs to be designed going forward, is the expectation that there's multiple IDs.
Yeah, and the way I looked at it when I was part of Beeswax was that all these folks would ask us all the time to be able to bid on their IDs, and the question for me was always, where is the raw data coming from that will make it actionable? And that raw data generally was coming from our customers. And that's why we did at Beeswax implement the RAMP ID, because so many of our customers were using LiveRamp for onboarding or using the graph in different ways, so that we had that connection from the customer to the inventory. Whereas a different ID, I won't say particular pick on anyone, but a different ID might have a lot of root, but doesn't on the back end of our side. So we would have to, effectively either force our customers to become customers of that ID's products or build an onboarding service ourselves that somehow matched their IDs to it. So it just wasn't as compelling. So usefulness is really the end goal here. You want to be able to actually use this ID, not just have it. So this is a pretty exciting area. I think if you imagine a world where an ID or some IDs are used on virtually every transaction to transact, to measure, to do attribution, et cetera, if someone owns that ID and is charging a fee on that could be quite a big business, don't you think?
I think it's huge. I think it could, it's basically the currency at which like a lot of these elements get transacted, particularly as you start to think about these new workflows that are emerging. Like, what does it look like when you mentioned CDPs and passing data from, directly from a transaction on a merchant and then being able to reach those users? Like, it becomes incredibly important. And I think what's interesting about the identifiers is that the scenarios of how customers can use them continues to grow. And I think that's exciting, certainly from a business model perspective and just observing the space.
Totally agree with you.
All right, let's move on from IDs. Let's do somewhat of a news wrap up. What's going on in the market over the past week? Last week, we had the bombshell DOJ thing, took up almost all of our time. This week is a smattering of interesting things. I'll start with the sort of dust up between the IAB, the 4As, and the ANA. Mike, were you at the IAB Leadership Conference?
Yeah, I was there.
Okay. Neither Eric or I were there, so you're the only witness to the crimes being discussed.
Did you see the speech in question? Did you attend, Mike?
I didn't see the speech in question. I saw a couple of tweets after the fact. I hate to do the classic ad tech thing. It's like, oh, I was there for the meetings. So I missed the speech, but I was surprised how much legs the story had.
All right, so let me try to summarize really quick here. IAB had its annual leadership meeting. The IAB CEO, David Cohen, gave a speech that was a bit prickly about the behaviors of privacy advocates and lawmakers and Apple in this ongoing sort of rugby scrum around privacy. And in reaction, surprisingly, several of the other trade groups, namely the 4As and ANA, put out a statement saying they weren't pleased with the tone of the conversation and making some remarks about as responsible marketers, we need to continue to put forward reasonable recommendations, blah, 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 blah. So is this a real disagreement, or is it just that Mr. Cohen said the things that we all think out loud? Anyone want to take
Eric,
that? Eric, I'm calling on you.
I found that last line funny. So there's precedent for this. I can recall in previous ALMs that I attended, Randall had some fire and brimstone type of speeches. Again, I wasn't there, but I get the gist of what he was talking about. The IAB, even though it's sort of like representative of the entire ecosystem, now that their models changed a little bit, it's traditionally been representative of the sell side, publishers and platforms. And those are the constituents that some of the regulation and certainly the Apple changes have hurt the most. So I feel like he was, in defense of his, constituency. And then on the other side, I do get what the ANA and the 4As, where they're coming from in, just like, representing the marketers. And I think marketers waking up to the fact that they need to be, very much, consumer centric and thinking about the consumer experience and privacy. So I think it's a little bit of just, speaking to and for their constituent bases, more than anything else.
And Mike, was there any buzz at the conference about his talking points, or does this only come out afterwards?
I only saw it on Twitter, to be honest. I didn't hear a lot of people talking about it. So I thought it was interesting. And then sort of reading the text and some of the quotes, what strikes me, and I'll sort of put the ANA response to the side, it's just like, it just feels like somewhat of an unforced error. Like, I do think there are, let's call it like extremists on either side. And there are some folks who are operating from the privacy, like max privacy scenario, but their real position is that effectively advertising shouldn't exist. And so there's not really a discussion or something that can, a compromise that can come forward when that's your starting position. And I think too often both sides are sort of polluted with folks who have like, nothing should change and, advertising should not exist. It's a terrible blight on humanity. And it's like, when you have those folks participating, it just gets heated. It's sort of point one. And so I think the speeches felt like it was directed against those folks, like using words like extremists, but then finally, like using things like privacy is a war to be won, like just like these violent, like macho words. It's like, I don't know who that serves, like in what degree, like, is that suddenly going to get people to take the IEB more seriously? I've thought that one of the issues for the longest time when Apple was doing, all of their policy changes, they didn't talk to the IAB because they didn't necessarily seem to view them as a credible partner where they could compromise. And this kind of
that's actually, sorry to interrupt, but that news came out subsequently, that the IAB and Apple are actually having a meeting. It's like,
right. Maybe this is 4D chess and this was all along, but to me, it's just like this kind of like, super macho hyperbole. It doesn't seem to me, it seems like it creates more entrenchment than it does compromise. Now, we'll see what happens with this meeting. I think it's super cool that there's a meeting happening. But yeah, that to me was my read, is like, I'm glad it wasn't just like a mealy mouth, nothing burger of a speech and platitudes, but also like, does it have to be so fire and brimstone?
Yeah. God, I would love to be in that Apple IAB meeting, but I'm not going to be invited. All right. Another piece of news that's been going around is earnings season. So as of today, when we're recording this, Facebook Meta shares are skyrocketing. Meanwhile, Snap shares are falling, and they had pretty similar results, which was ad revenue was basically flat. I think Meta was up 2% in constant currency on ad revenue year over year, but the outlook for Snap was quite poor. And I'm not sure. Is there a bigger lesson here, or is this just companies executing, not executing? Eric, maybe you want to take that one?
I mean, sentiment around Meta was so negative for quite some time. I mean, the stock went down to like $90 something, and I think it's doubled from there. I think people have been, really concerned about the focus on metaverse, concerned about the long-term effects of the Apple identity problem, questions around employee numbers and all that. And yeah, I mean, if you take a step back, they showed good progress in stemming some of the bleeding from a revenue standpoint. Up 2%. They showed that they're investing where they should, i.e., in artificial intelligence, and showing promise there. Some of the metrics that they point to are not necessarily like apples to apples, but they said like conversions are up something like 20%. So I think it's good signaling that they're focused on the core, they're focused on the product, they're focused on investing in AI, which from my perspective should really be the focus for the company. And they're just operating at scale. I mean, it's 2 billion users, right? And they're doing a massive stock buyback, which the street wanted. So with Zuck, I mean, it's hard to bet against that guy. Oftentimes, things get really, really negative, and people think this thing is about to fall apart. And he comes back hard, comes back swinging. So good on them.
Yeah, I think there's still a question around growth. I mean, if the last 3 or 4 quarters, growth has been anemic or negative in several quarters. So if you look at Meta, a scaled company with no growth, the valuation should be kind of just an old-fashioned DCF of how much money it makes versus how long it's going to continue. I do wonder where the growth comes from in these out years, given limited M&A opportunities and the metaverse going slowly, et cetera, et cetera. Not a question for anyone, but just my opinion. Mike, do you have any thoughts on this?
I thought it was really cool. I mean, Eric, I think maybe this is what you meant by AI, but the probabilistic attribution to me is the most interesting element out of all of this. And so I wonder, is there a moat around that? And if customers can buy in and they believe the probabilistic attribution, what does that mean for others who do similarly? Like, is there a moat that Facebook can only do this? How do they trust but verify if you're a marketer?
Yeah, I think you have to be very large to do probabilistic attribution at scale, because you need all that data and all the variations of the data. And really, Google and Meta are the two that have put it out there and are in, production with that at scale. I do wonder if someone the size of Snap, which has far less data, does not have pixels on web pages, does not have, the history of 20 years or however many years of commerce, if they could do anything that is remotely like what Google and Meta can do in terms of using AI for marketing purposes.
That's exactly right. And which is why I think it's fantastic. Again, if you are an employee or a fan or investor in Meta, that they're focused here, which is, I think one of their moats, and I think a long-term strategic advantage, because they're just so large, and the models can just get better and better.
So let's close this out on a tweet that I sent. Obviously, the main content of this entire podcast are my tweets. So I sent out this tweet asking people to rank what the worst job in tech is. And so I'll list you the options, and you can tell me your point of view. Obviously, you're both gainfully employed, so not looking for a job these days, which are pretty hard to find. All right, what is the worst job in tech? HR at Google, investor relations, IR at Snap, PR at Meta, or product at Twitter. Mike, do you want to take it? What's your vote?
I think the comments said it super well, that there is a huge time series component, but I think I voted for, and it was product at Twitter.
Right. So product at Twitter was my vote as well. And it's important to note that it has been a bad job forever. It hasn't just been a bad job under the current management. Product at Twitter has been a bad job since Twitter was founded under, I think it's 5th CEO now. Product's always been a bad job there. Eric, what's your vote?
I give Twitter credit. The product is getting better. Just the view counts and what they're doing in terms of making it faster, and they're shipping. They hadn't shipped in years. They're shipping. So I think the fact that it's got such low expectations and there's such bad precedent, I think it could be like the best job in tech, because you can show that this thing can actually work, and you can ship, and you can change some hearts and minds. I think HR at Google, specifically over the course of the past few weeks and months, probably gets my vote. It sounds like it was a pretty tough time a couple of weeks ago.
historically, the entitlement at Google must have been pretty rankling to be in HR and have the people paid as much as they are, getting the free massages and everything, and still complaining about everything.
Yeah, and again, it's like it's a scale thing. There was that quote that everybody pulled out that because their layoffs thought it was kind of bungled. They have 30,000 managers. So it's like, we can't tell all the managers because we have 30,000 managers. It's wild, just the org that has been sort of created over time there.
Eric,
well, that's your problem right there, right? Your 30,000 managers.
Mike, what did you just ask?
I said, what kind of car do you drive?
Really?
Yeah, curious. Is it a Tesla?
I drive a Tesla.
Oh, wow. Gee, I'm a real carnac. I guess I agree with Ari that it's been a bad job for a long time. I think it's a very difficult and thankless job, but I think like right now, like I think if you're planting a flag on tweet view counts as, innovation and ship velocity, I think there's maybe a job at the White House press secretary, the way that you can spin some of these things, because that is impressive stuff.
Whoa, getting spicy here. All right, let's close it out on that. As a reminder, you can get our in-depth interviews with CTOs at Marketecture TV, in addition to this weekly podcast. And please subscribe. There's a free subscription as well as a paid subscription. So Mike and Eric, thank you so much for being here. This is a great conversation.
Yeah, thank you. The top 10 identifiers was awesome. So thanks, Mike, for doing that.
Of course. Thank you guys for having me. It was a blast.
Thank you for subscribing to Marketecture. New interviews are added every week at marketecture.tv and your favorite podcasting app.